The sky above the dead planet was the color of rust and old blood, a vast, choking expanse of dust-choked clouds and sickly light. Captain Mikhail Petrov adjusted the seal on his helmet, feeling the weight of a world that did not want them here pressing down on his chest. The land beneath his boots was brittle, cracking underfoot like dry bone. Nothing about this place was natural. Nothing about it was welcoming. Yet here they stood, humanity's best and brightest, staring across the barren wasteland at creatures that should not exist. The Zerixali. The aliens loomed tall and segmented, like the husks of some enormous predatory insect sculpted from obsidian and cold steel. Their exoskeletons shimmered, reflecting distorted images of the human expedition team. Captain Petrov had spent his life staring down the unknown, but there was something profoundly unsettling about the way these things moved, too smooth, too calculated, as if every twitch of their limbs had been rehearsed 1,000 times before. Dr. Adrian Voss, humanity's foremost xenolinguist, took a cautious step forward. His suit, pristine and marked with the insignia of Earth's unified space agency, stood in stark contrast to the bleak terrain. He raised a gloved hand in what was meant to be a universal greeting. One of the Zerixali clicked its mandibles together, producing a sharp, chittering sound that their AI-assisted translators struggled to process. A moment later, a voice, cold, artificial, echoed through their helmets. Soft, weak, curious. The words dripped with an amusement that needed no translation. The aliens were laughing. Petrov felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. They had encountered other species before, but none that had been so openly dismissive. Even the more hostile ones had treated humanity as a challenge, a species to be wary of. But these creatures, they saw Earth's finest as nothing more than an oddity. Sergeant Ivan Markov, built like a relic from a time when men settled disputes with their fists instead of diplomacy, bristled. "They think we're a joke," he muttered, fingers tightening on the rifle slung across his chest. Voss ignored him, adjusting the frequency of the translation module. "We come in peace," he said carefully. "We are explorers, seekers of knowledge. We do not wish for conflict." The Zerixali shifted, their bodies moving in eerie synchronization. Another voice, different this time, yet carrying the same undertone of amusement, answered. "Your conflict is irrelevant. Your existence is irrelevant." A pause. The air felt heavier. "Your myths are amusing." The last part caught them off guard. Voss frowned, glancing at his wrist console, scanning for any sign of an error in the linguistic relay. "Clarify," he demanded, unable to hide the edge in his voice. The alien lifted one of its clawed appendages, and a stream of distorted data flickered through the air, stolen fragments of human history, cultural records, myths, legends. Among them, one name stood out, repeated across multiple languages, spanning centuries of folklore. Baba Yaga. The laugh returned, this time from multiple throats, a grating, insectal mockery that burrowed under their skin. A crone in the woods. A primitive fear. "You whisper of monsters. You are not the monsters." Markov shifted beside him. "They're talking about a damn fairy tale?" Petrov didn't like it. The Zerixali weren't mocking humanity's weapons or technology. They weren't laughing at their fleet, their soldiers, or their sciences. They were laughing at their fears. Voss straightened, something dark flickering behind his eyes. "Fear is power," he said, evenly. "You should know that." The Zerixali moved closer, not aggressive, but dissecting, as if inspecting something that fascinated them on a fundamental level. "Your fear is meaningless." Petrov's gut told him they had overstayed their welcome. "We should move," he said, voice measured. "We've seen enough." Voss hesitated but nodded, stepping back. Markov didn't lower his weapon as he followed. They turned toward their transport, the dust swirling around their boots, the shadows stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. Behind them, the Zerixali continued their laughter. The descent into the ruins was slow, each step stirring up clouds of dust that had not been disturbed in centuries. Captain Mikhail Petrov led the way, his rifle slung over his shoulder, though he knew instinctively that bullets would do little against whatever lingered here. Behind him, Dr. Adrian Voss adjusted the settings on his wrist scanner, the device pulsing weakly in the darkness. The air was thick, heavier than it should have been, pressing against them like unseen hands. Sergeant Ivan Markov, ever the skeptic, muttered a curse under his breath. "This place is wrong." His voice, usually solid as iron, wavered slightly. Father Vasily Romanov walked beside him, fingers ghosting over the carved stone walls as they moved deeper underground. The priest had been a reluctant addition to the mission, but after the Zerixley's bizarre interest in human myths, the higher-ups had insisted on bringing someone versed in the old ways. Vasily's presence was a reminder that some knowledge did not come from books or data streams, but from whispered prayers and sleepless nights. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling lost to shadow. Blackened pillars loomed, carved with symbols that did not belong to any known human language, yet felt disturbingly familiar. At the center of the chamber lay a dais, its edges worn smooth by time. A throne, hewn from jagged stone, stood at its heart, and upon it, something waited. Voss hesitated, scanning the figure. "There's no biological reading," he said, voice tight. "It shouldn't be here." The thing on the throne was little more than a silhouette, impossibly old, impossibly still. Not a corpse, not a statue, something between. The longer they looked, the harder it was to focus, as if their minds rejected its presence. Markov took a cautious step forward. The second his boot scraped the stone, the laughter stopped. Not his, not Voss's, not even the distant echoes of the Zerixley above. It was the ruins themselves, breathing silence into existence. The air thickened, a deep cold seeping into their bones. The shadows twisted, pooling like ink around the throne. Then movement, a slow, deliberate tilt of the head. Mikhail barely had time to react before his radio crackled with static. A voice, rasping, ancient, filled the chamber. "You bring them to me." The words did not come from any speaker, nor from the figure itself. They existed, pressing into their skulls like fingers digging into flesh. Vasily swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the cross at his neck. "We do not summon," he said carefully. "We were led here." The shadows pulsed, stretching toward them. Voss flinched, the scanner in his hand flickering wildly. "Electromagnetic disturbance is off the charts," he whispered. "This thing, this presence, it's generating an impossible energy signature." "They laugh." The voice slithered through the space between heartbeats, ancient amusement curdling into something colder. "They do not understand fear." Markov's fingers twitched toward his weapon. "Who?" The answer came not in words, but in sensation, an overwhelming wave of distant, chittering laughter, the memory of mandibles clicking together in scorn. The Zerixley. The room seemed to exhale, the darkness receding ever so slightly. The figure on the throne shifted, a slow, unnatural movement, like something remembering how to inhabit flesh. "They have forgotten the old ways." Voss took an involuntary step back. "And you remember?" A pause. Then the sound of something unfurling, not fabric, but something deeper, older. "I am the old ways." The chamber trembled. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the ruins, dust raining down from unseen heights. Above, faintly, the team could hear something else. Distant, hollow. The Zerixley had stopped laughing. Markov exhaled slowly, gripping his weapon as the figure fully lifted its head. The shadows peeled away, revealing a face that was not a face, an absence wrapped in the illusion of human form. Eyes too deep, skin too pale, a smile that did not belong. They will learn. Then the torches lining the walls, torches that had never been lit, flared to life. The Zerixley warship hung above the ruined world like a silent predator, its dark hull absorbing the feeble light from the dying sun. Inside, the alien hive mind pulsed with confidence, their laughter still lingering in the collective consciousness. The humans had been insignificant. Their myths had been amusing. And yet, something had changed. The laughter had stopped, Commander XY clicked his mandibles, uneasy. The silence pressing against the ship's corridors was unnatural. Even within the hive mind, where thoughts flowed freely, there was a strange absence, a gap where certain voices should have been. A handful of scouts had gone planet-side to observe the humans' next movements, yet no reports had returned. Not of battle, not of discovery. Nothing. He reached out, extending his mind into the ship's network, summoning the missing warriors. Only Void answered. Deep within the ship, in the observation bay, another Zerixley VA cache reviewed the last recorded footage from the ground team. The images flickered across the projection field, grainy due to interference, but clear enough. The humans had descended into the ruins. The Zerixley scouts had been watching from a distance, their cloaking fields making them invisible to primitive eyes. The footage showed them moving closer, drawn by the strange energy signature the humans had disturbed. Then the image distorted. A wave of interference crawled across the screen like oil on water. The shapes of the humans blurred, then sharpened again. But something else was there now, something wrong. A shape moved at the edges of the feed, indistinct, shifting between frames like a trick of the light. No defined form, no clear movement, only the suggestion of presence. Then the first Zerixley scout vanished. No struggle, no warning. One frame, he was there. The next, he was gone. His absence noticed only when his companions turned and realized they were one fewer. The recording continued. The others hesitated, their bodies tense. More interference. Another flicker. Another scout gone. V.A. Kesh's mandibles twitched. He had seen the species of the galaxy at war. He had watched as entire civilizations fell to the Zerixley. But this was different. There was no enemy in the frame, no weapon to analyze. Just absence, spreading like a virus. The footage ended abruptly, corrupted by a final burst of static. V.A. Kesh turned to his commander, his unease radiating through the hive link. Something hunts us. XY Thal dismissed the notion with a sharp click of his mandibles. Impossible. The humans have nothing capable of this. It is a malfunction, a deception. But even as he spoke, the hive mind trembled. More voices were fading. Not just from the surface, from the ship itself. In the lower decks, a warrior patrol moved through the dimly lit corridors, their weapons charged, their multifaceted eyes scanning for movement. They did not understand fear as humans did, but something primal skittered at the edges of their instincts, an ancient residue buried deep in their genetic memory. A shadow moved, not ahead, not behind, between. One of the warriors hesitated. He felt something brush against him, something thin and clawed. He turned. He was gone. The others did not see where he had gone. There was no sound, no scream, only the whisper of something shifting just beyond perception. They opened fire. The corridor erupted in light as plasma around seared the air, burning the walls but striking nothing. Their weapons cast long, writhing shadows that did not match their own. One shadow, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, stretched toward them, moving against the light. Another warrior fell. Then another. The last survivor backed against the bulkhead, his breath coming in sharp, uneven clicks. He reached for the hive mind, desperate for orders, for guidance. All he heard was laughter. Not theirs. Slow, deliberate, ancient. The lights overhead flickered. In the brief moments of darkness, something stepped closer. When the lights returned, he was alone. On the command deck, XY Thal felt the loss ripple through the hive mind like a severed limb. Entire sections of the ship had gone dark. No distress signals. No resistance. Only silence. Seal the inner chambers, he ordered, his voice carrying across the telepathic network. Purge anything not of the hive. Automated defenses hum to life. Purge protocols activated, flooding corridors with fire and energy bursts. Nothing organic could survive. For a moment, there was peace. Then the lights failed entirely. In the darkness, something moved. Clawed fingers traced the walls, dragging the scent of ancient forests and burning bones into the sterilized halls. The purge systems began shutting down, one by one, as if the ship itself had become unwilling to resist. Somewhere, deep within the void of the hive mind, a voice slithered through. They have forgotten the old ways. Xythal's body locked, his limbs frozen as a primal, unwanted realization settled upon him. The humans had not brought a weapon to this planet. They had brought something much worse. The hunt had begun. The Zerixley warship was dying. Its vast corridors, once filled with the disciplined movements of an unstoppable species, now echoed with silence. The hive mind flickered, fractured by something it could not understand, something that slithered between the spaces of its collective thoughts. Xythal staggered through the command deck, his limbs twitching, mandibles clicking in agitation. The warship systems were failing one by one, communications, navigation, even the core containment fields. Every attempt to reassert control was met with failure. Every command he gave was swallowed by a force that did not belong. He reached out, calling to the hive mind, expecting the familiar press of thousands of voices. Instead, he found absence. No, not absence. Something watching. The lights flickered, and in their brief return, the bridge was no longer empty. It sat upon the elevated throne where Xythal had once ruled. A silhouette of impossible angles, shifting between the familiar and the unfathomable. It had no eyes, yet he felt its gaze pressing into him, dissecting his essence with cruel amusement. A voice, rich with the weight of centuries, whispered through the chamber. "You have forgotten fear." Xythal raised his plasma rifle, firing before thought could register. The blast tore through the space where the figure sat, searing the throne into molten slag. But when the light faded, the throne remained untouched. The figure remained, and it laughed, not the chittering, clattering mockery of the Zerixley. No, this was deeper, older. A laughter that belonged to things that lurked in the dark corners of the universe, to myths that refused to die. It was the sound of cold winds through ancient forests, of bones cracking under unseen hands. Xythal lunged, his claws extending, his instincts demanding action. He was fast, his kind had always been fast, but the space between them stretched impossibly, as if the universe itself had decided that he would never reach his prey. The figure stood, not in the way mortals moved, but as if it had always been standing, and the illusion of sitting had merely been a kindness. Xythal froze. He did not want to, but his body refused to obey. "You laugh at ghosts," the voice murmured. "Yet you are the ones who will be forgotten." The shadows deepened, not by light, not by movement, but by sheer will, a darkness that swallowed reality itself, dragging it into something older than time. Across the warship, the remaining Zerixley convulsed, their minds ruptured by something they had no defense against. Their exoskeletons cracked as their forms twisted, pulled toward a place beyond comprehension. No weapons fired. No screams were heard. Only the fading remnants of a species that had thought itself untouchable. Xythal, the last of his kind, stood trembling before the figure. His mandibles clicked, forming words that had never before existed in the Zerixley tongue. "What are you?" The figure leaned closer, though it did not move. The warship's walls groaned, as if reality itself recoiled from the answer. "I am the story whispered in the dark." Xythal tried to run. He did not succeed. Far below, on the ruined world, Captain Mikhail Petrov and his team stood in the dust, gazing up at the silent warship. The Zerixley vessel, once a monument to their dominance, now hung lifeless in orbit, its lights extinguished. No movement, no signals. Markov exhaled, shouldering his rifle. Think they got the message? Voss, still pale from what they had witnessed, glanced at Father Vasily, who remained silent, staring at the sky. The priest finally spoke. "There is no coming back from what they met up there." Petrov nodded, feeling the weight of what they had done. The Zerixley had laughed at humanity's fears, at their myths, at the stories that had kept them awake at night for centuries. But in the end, the last laugh had not belonged to them. It had belonged to her. The wreckage of the Zerixley warship drifted in the void, its once impenetrable hull cracked and lifeless. No distress signals pulsed through the cold expanse. No scavengers dared approach. It was not simply a ruined vessel, it was a warning. Captain Mikhail Petrov watched from the surface, his gaze fixed on the dead colossus in orbit. Even now, standing in the ruins of an ancient civilization, the air around him felt lighter, as if a weight had lifted from the planet itself. And yet, something lingered. Sergeant Markov kicked at the dust, breaking the silence. So that's it then? The Zerixali are finished? Dr. Adrian Voss adjusted the settings on his scanner, though he already knew the answer. That ship was their command vessel. Their strongest. If they couldn't resist, the rest of the fleet won't even try. Petrov exhaled, his breath forming a thin mist in the cold air. They won't forget this. If any of them survive, they'll spread the story. Father Vasily Romanov stood a few steps away, his hands clasped, his lips moving in silent prayer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. Good. The word carried weight. Fear had always been humanity's burden. It lurked in the edges of firelight, in the howling winds of empty places. It shaped myths, bred caution, kept them alive when the dark was too deep and the world too vast. The Zerixali had mocked that fear, believing themselves above it. But fear was not weakness. It was memory. It was preparation. It was the whisper that said, something waits in the dark. And they had awakened what waited. Voss hesitated before speaking again. Do you think she's gone? No one answered. The torches lining the ancient walls still burned, though no one had lit them. The air still carried the scent of something that did not belong to time. The ruins had been dead for centuries until now. Markov shifted uneasily. So, what happens next? Petrov looked to the sky, where the wreckage of the warship caught the last rays of the dying sun. We leave, and we let the galaxy tell the tale. Vasily traced a symbol in the dust, something old, something half-forgotten. They will not believe at first. They don't have to, Petrov said. They'll listen, and when they hear laughter in the dark, they'll wonder. That's enough. The team gathered their gear. The mission was over, but something larger had begun. Humanity had sent its message, not through fleets, not through firepower, but through something older, something far more enduring. The Zerixali had laughed at their fears. Now, the universe would learn to fear them.